So now we'll move on to the lines on move 4 in the actual Hertz, so to speak, after the third move G6. Now white has a lot of playable lines, all of them covered in this course, and some are big and theory heavy. Some of them are sort of just good to know. Yeah. So now we'll just cover those good to know lines that, as the name suggests, they're good to know, but if you forget some detail here or there, this will not be tragic. Yeah, at least this is the hope. So let's just see what lines are those. So basically, it's all sorts of various F3s. It's one of those moves that looks good but doesn't really do very much. Bishop F4, which is one of those, awkward-looking moves, and various sort of early bishop developments, sort of not very timely most of the time, but some of them are quite interesting. And then after all of this, there is also a big one and quite a serious line, a line that is maybe, a good, not just good to know, but sort of vital to know line, the one with G3, useful to know your way around the setup. So please don't be scared by the sheer number of things. These lines are sort of easy to chalk off, yes, a lot of them. So let's get going. So F3 has a point. Bishop goes to E3, and white prevents knight G4. But also there is there's something to be said about all these F3 setups. The pawn does not do so much on F3. And it's more of a visual thing, right? White plays F3, bishop G7. Now this sort of the pawn on D4 is more difficult to protect because the white pawn is on F3. But for now, let me just get rid of these things so we can move on undisturbed. Yeah. So bishop on G7 exerts the unpleasant pressure in basically all lines, but it's more felt now since, white cannot play the usual knight F3. So white plays bishop E3, C6. This is our setup in bishop E3. So we can also just keep it here. And queen D2, this normal thing. And this transposes into the line which is covered in some detail in the bishop E3 system, right? So when white plays bishop E3 in this position. So F3 both doesn't have the independent value, so to speak. If white wants to play F3, should start with bishop E3. But more importantly, it's also not great. Like in these positions, once again, going there, it's very rare for black to be able to play knight G4 profitably. Anyway, yeah? And white is better off just playing bishop E3, queen D2, and the like. Yeah, the pawn on F3 aesthetically looks useful, costs a tempo, is not always useful. Yeah, so it's not a great line, and as I said, we'll transpose into the line which is covered separately. But for now, it's enough to know that F3 is not very threatening, not anything you should spend sleepless nights over. So we move out of this line and we look at bishop F4, which is another one of those lines. Bishop F4, I was surprised to discover, is very popular. And I personally do not understand, because to me it just looks like a sort of weaker version of bishop E3. The bishop is just not really excellently placed on F4. because it's vulnerable, right? White needs to reckon sometimes with knight h5 and sometimes also with e5 after some preparation, or sometimes without. So I just do not see the attraction, honestly, but let's just make some moves. Bishop g7. Yeah, I'm still relying on T for these recordings, although recently I switched the type of tea. I thought the green tea would do it for me, but now we'll go back to the good old reliable black tea. Very important part of any chess player's repertoire, as you will find out, when you become a professional player. So bishop g7, queen d2 is a natural follow-up. And once again, we'll play c6. Preparing b5. So basically, we are doing the same things would do after bishop e3, and now it's up to white to sort of show the difference. So why is it that the bishop is on f4 and not on e3? Because e3 is both safer for white and keeps this pawn alive, and also I think more natural, right? And now let's take a look at some lines. So bishop h6 is a straight up transposition. So white just goes into the bishop e3 line. And maybe that's what white should also do in this position, but not a theme for now. Knight f3 is reasonable, but is actually quite sort of boring, right? Black just plays bishop g4, threatening bishop takes f3. These pawns would be weak. So bishop e2 is normal. Knight bd7, and now black is already threatening sometimes to go e5, showing that the bishop on f4 is not ideal, sometimes threatening b5, b4. And in general, I think black just gets a very good version of the setup. And castles long is normal. b5, again threatening b4. This pawn is vulnerable. Bishop d3, b4, and basically black just starts attacking, and at no point did I understand why the bishop on f4 made it better for white, as compared to any other systems. So for instance, knight a4 is just sort of plain bad. It's queen a5, b3, knight b7, black just starts attacking. Knight b6 is an immediate threat, and this knight is problematic, this king is problematic. And maybe black can also play c5, opening this diagonal. So anyway, white should not go for this. And to keep it safer, white should probably play knight c2 here. Queen a5 anyway. And black is generating threats, right? The first one to generate threats, always a bad sign for white. Should not be like this, really. So king b1, bishop e6. Every move is a threat in this line, so black is now threatening mate, basically. Knight c1, queen b6. Other moves are possible, but it's actually quite useful to get out of knight b3. Yeah? The queen was vulnerable on a5 a bit, so we move it back, attacking the pawn at the same time. So white protects the pawn, we play c5. So this is one of those lines where black actually got the initiative, right? Every move is a threat of some sorts. Some are very serious threats, some are minor threats, but anyway, black is the one with the initiative, threatening c5, c5, c4, opening the diagonals, and white has to be careful to stay alive, which is not a great advertisement for this whole line. So I'm not saying white will get a bad position by playing bishop f4. I'm just saying that, if you want to play bishop f4, you are better off playing bishop e3. This is basically my point. So the same is true for f3. Both these moves, they can lead to decent positions, but they are basically the worst version of the line with bishop e3 here. So now moving on, let's take a look at bishop c4, which is a pretty good line. Bishop c4. So yeah, this move is getting popular of late. Usually I would tell you, the bishop on c4 is early, and f7 is not really weak, and whatnot, as was the case a couple of moves ago, right, when white tried bishop c4 on move 2. But things are a bit different here. There is actually a reason behind this bishop c4 development, and we'll see it on the next move. Yeah, so bishop g7 and queen e2. This is basically how white makes sense of this development. The bishop comes to c4 early, the queen on e2 immediately after, and white is actually threatening or intending to go e5, e6. So there is some point behind white setup, and it has been becoming increasingly popular lately, as in fact some other bishop c4 setups. You will see them, every now and then. And sometimes when your opponent makes a move, it's very useful to ask yourself, like, what changed in the position? Like, what can I do now what I couldn't do before? So you could also ask yourself this: what happened after queen e2? And very likely you will notice that the d4 pawn is now vulnerable, right? It wasn't the case before. It was not hanging before. It is potentially hanging now. And this gives us new ideas, and one of those rare cases in this opening where we play knight c6, because the central pawn is hanging, and why shouldn't we profit from this, right? Develop the knight with a gain of time. And normally, if white had to defend this pawn with, let's say, bishop e3 or knight f3, we could go either e5 or bishop g4, just get a great position, everything would be fantastic. But things are not so simple here. There is a reason why this setup is becoming popular lately, and this whole reason is e5. So white ignores the fact that the pawn on d4 is hanging and just continues with the plan. And this is actually an invitation for a very strange looking position. So our move here is knight g4, but it's interesting to sort of at least know why we are not playing knight takes d4, right? White's idea here is to play ef6, knight takes e2, fg7. So you see this line, not this line, but this idea sometimes in various openings, like there is a line in Grunfeld which leads to a similar kind of material balance. So basically white gets three, maybe we can color them green since they are pretty active, three pieces for the queen. And black also has a couple of central pawns, right? And materially, black is doing great, but white is actually much better developed and can continue with, let's say, bishop h6, castle long, rook he1. And basically, it seems that despite the fact that technically black is something up, a couple of central pawns, it's very difficult for black to play this position properly. And I just found it easier to recommend knight g4, where black is also fighting for the initiative in the opening. Yeah, you don't have to sort of give it to white too easily. Furthermore, white has pawns hanging, so the pawns are very strong, but currently they are hanging, right? Black is threatening d takes e5, also threatening knight takes d4. And white, in fact, has only one way to defend the central pawns, by playing bishop b5. So before we look at bishop b5, e6 just doesn't work, because black can just take knight takes d4. It looks a bit dangerous to do this, but white just doesn't get enough for the sacrificed material. Black takes this rook, and all white can do is, take on f7, and then king on f8 will be very safe, and black will be an exchange up and more. Yeah, so this just doesn't work. The bishop b5 is the only move. White survives for now by the virtue of the spin. Black cannot take on d4 and cannot take on e5 yet, because white is also threatening d5. So white is just in time to defend the central pawns. So black castles, renewing the threat, or renewing the threats actually, and white has to take bishop c6, otherwise white would lose at least a pawn. bc, and now we can calm down a lot, or a bit. Calm down a lot, yeah, that's funny. So a bit, and sort of take some stock what happened for now, right? As black is better developed, has the bishops, and everything is great, but this knight will be pushed back. Yeah, so for now, we understand what this fight is about. White sort of tries to dominate this knight on h6. Yeah, it's only square, otherwise we would probably not go to h6 voluntarily. But this knight is not as bad there as you might think. One day it will come to f5, or sometimes it comes to f7, but one way or the other black will be able to join the fight with the knight. So knight f3 is normal. And here, okay, black has various ways to play, but I quite like this move queen d7. The move controls the vital e6 square. And by controlling this, we enable f6, more or less next move. Basically important for us to make sure white cannot play e6. So for instance, if white now goes bishop f4, we play just f6, and we open not only the diagonals, we also open the f file, which is great since the white bishop on f4 is hanging, right? So no matter what white does, black will open the files and the diagonals, and will be probably better very soon. So bishop f4 is not great. Castles is probably better. And also here, we could really go f6. Nothing wrong with that. But okay, rook e1, then again we have to defend against e6, right? So I have to watch for the square, and but something's changed, right? I mean, white castled short, and this basically enables us to play knight f5 without hesitation, because white cannot really play g4 anymore, since this would weaken this king considerably, and which means we can just occupy this great position with the knight. And basically now black is just really doing fine, threatening sometimes f6, sometimes c5. Not many lines here which are important. For instance, after rook d1, f6 is very easy. Black controls the square, and both the bishops will come to life very soon. So maybe rook e1 is more proper. Once again, fighting for e6 and preventing f6. Here also black has a lot of plausible moves. Could go, for instance, rook b8 or a5. There are a lot of ways to develop here. But can also play for immediate initiative with c5, undermining white's central pawns and opening this really scary looking diagonal. dc has to be played, and I just bishop b7. We are basically playing for the compensation. Our bishops are very strong. And whenever white takes on d6, for instance now, we recapture with the e7 pawn. And after recapturing with the e7 pawn, the e file will be open. And then at some point, it will really stop being funny for white. Black's bishops and the edge in development are just too much. So white has to make sure everything stays closed, and everything stays closed. And there is no better move than bishop f4 for this, because black was also threatening bishop f3 and bishop e5, right? So the bishop defends this pawn. And white seems to have regained control and is basically asking black to take on c5, right? Please take on c5 and we can all, proceed with positional play. And now we have a nice little move, queen c6. I really like this. The queen joins this diagonal and black suddenly creates a new set of threats. Yeah. A tongue twister, yeah? What do you call them? Yeah, a tongue twister, I think. So, threatening knight d4, also threatening queen takes c5, and in general, just forcing white to take on d6 at some point. And it's always dangerous because then the rook will join the attack, and basically, okay, now that we have seen these arrows, let me remove them so that we can mention that, black has the bishops, and white will suffer due to the vulnerability, essentially, of the white king. So now that we are done with this line, let's move on. It's a big and an important line. So let's just go all the way back. It's a longish line, right? So it took me a while to get back. And now let's move to other moves by this bishop on f1. So one of them is bishop d3. Very often the bishop makes it to d3, especially online. Online, it seems that, bishop d3 is just some sort of an instinct. People don't know what to do. People play bishop d3, and we should be ready for this. In general, these two pieces, I think they do not do too well together. So when bishop on d3, the knight on c3, nobody really protects this pawn on d4. So I would say the setup is not very harmonious, but on the other hand, of course, white can develop their pieces any way they like. It's not a big deal, right? White has usually enough freedom in the opening to do various things. So we just go bishop g7 as always. And now f4 will transpose into the line that is covered in the Austrian attack. So for now, we will ignore it. Knight f3 transposes to one of the classical lines. So also for now, we'll ignore it. And this leaves us with knight g2, e5. It's usually very nice to get this pawn on e5, especially when the white knight is on e2. You'll see it throughout the course very often. This knight on e2 is simply misplaced when black can go e5. After this knight basically has no squares except for g3, and from g3 it has no squares. So basically this is one of these chronic themes. Yeah, this knight is not great. So white will probably castle, black will castle, and black after this continues with knight c6, or knight bd7 and c6, and has easy game, especially because, as we said, knight on e2, not amazing. So not a big line, we can move on. So the other move by this bishop, which is still left to cover, is bishop e2. Sometimes this move looks like, it enables white to attack. Maybe you could see the lines like, g4 or h4. We'll cover them, so no problem. In general, there is no attack. It's way too early for this, as you'll see. So bishop g7 is normal. And now white can try various, white can try various ways of acting nervously, so to speak. So just bear with me. It will all make sense one day. So g4 is one of those nervous movements. White prepares g5 or h4, h5, and tries to, say that the bishop on e2 makes sense because it controls the g4 square. But in fact, white is just not really ready for any of this. And black can just counter attack in the center. So just d5. Basically, if white takes on d5 twice, the black queen will be, we can just make it green. The black queen will be amazing on d5, attacking everything. And this leaves white with e5, which is usually a good thing. Getting this strong pawns, but then the pawn on g4 is completely useless. Like, it shouldn't be there. Like, plays knight e4 and then just continues with c5, knight c6, and the pawn on g4 is just sort of like, why is it even there, right? It serves no purpose. In fact, I would be really happy to be able to put it back, which is a bad sign, right? And h4 is better. H4 does not really create as many weaknesses as g4 would do. And yeah, there is some point. Yeah, you probably have heard of this, that Bent Larsen, said that doesn't create weaknesses and is often, better than it looks. He said it in different words, but that's basically what we understood, and we started implementing it like 40 years later when the computers started endorsing this idea. So basically, moving the h pawn does not create structural weaknesses at some point, and not just in this line, in every line, right? So if we, let's say, return to g4, strategically, you could say that this move weakens, this square, potentially other squares, and the king side, right? So in the same way, h4 has potential to create damage to white structure, but this damage is always much more limited. these pawns remain healthy, so white can still feel safe with the king on g1 if necessary. And the only square white can possibly weaken by this is the square g4, which is not as bad of a weakening, right? When you compare it to the weakness of the square f4. So basically, when comparing, you have to be much more careful when moving your g pawn as opposed to the h pawn. Basically, the h pawn is always free to go, right? It's not that big of a deal. The other important bit is that if you lose the h pawn or you sacrifice the h pawn, it's usually not as big of a sacrifice. It will open the h file, so there is some point to this. And also here, h4 is a much better move than g4, at least much, much more reasonable. And it threatens h5. White threatens to get some attack, so we should just stop it. And we should just block this pawn on h4 and make sure that we can use the weakness that white created of the g4 square. And now, okay, white has no choice but to develop, and we get some sort of a classical setup, but with these two moves included. White weakened the g4 square, and black has a slight weakness on the g5 square. And there's both sides having an outpost on the king side basically makes the position a bit closed. So we castle, knight g5 is a very popular move, and basically white prepares to develop and then play g4 at some point. So we should act before all this happens, and the best way to act is once again asking yourself, what happened on the last move? What opportunities do I now have that I did not have before? And essentially, what changed was white's last move, right? The white's last move was knight g5. And if you ask yourself this way, this is Vishy's favorite method. Some of you might know that I worked with Vishy for many years, learned a lot from him. And one of the things that he does is look very carefully at the opponent's last move. Sounds simple, but rarely implemented by other people. So now we understand that white's d4 pawn is now less protected than before. And this is the key for us, to start acting. Play knight c6, reminding white that we'll have some ways of creating problems around the d4 pawn. So white is just not in time here to do everything. So for instance, after f3, we are ready to go e5 and knight d4. That would be bad news for white. And slightly different theme here. If white plays d5 and we go knight e5, this square becomes a permanent weakness in white's camp, because g4 would create even more weaknesses. So basically, this is one thing to remember, right? With the pawns h4, h5 included, white should not allow the knight to e5. It's a slightly sophisticated point, but might be useful for you in some lines, King's Indian and the like. And white is just not in time to get everything. So white starts by going bishop e3. And now we go knight g4. And once again, white is just one move short from achieving everything. And basically, we'll get two bishops. We'll get the two bishops. We'll either take on e3. This would create bad weaknesses in white's position, or more realistically, after bishop g4, we will get the two bishops in this way, after which we'll have two strong bishops and still keep the possibility to open the position with e5. So basically, a playable position by all means, but I would rather be black. I think black's prospects are clearer and the bishops are powerful. Yeah, so let's move back and move on. So this was h4, a more reasonable move than g4, but you saw it didn't bring white anything great. So the other way to sort of avoid transposing to big lines is to play bishop e3. It's a reasonably popular move. Sometimes also in the King's Indian, sometimes there is this fascination to have the bishop on e3 and bishop on e2. And I sometimes think that, people choose their lines for aesthetic purposes. Maybe these bishops next to each other, they look harmonious, but they don't really do very much, to be honest. So bishop e3, castles, queen d2 makes sense. But the truth of it is that white can also do this without bishop e2. So this is a tempo that white spent to get the setup that they could get anyway. White could always play bishop e3, queen d2, and then decide what to do next, right? So this bishop on e2 is not necessary for this setup, and we can just play centrally, play e5, and get some play against white's pawns in the center. White can either allow this, and this is very easy. We just attack the central pawn, and then we undermine it, and start threatening c5 and the like, and get a very promising looking position. Or white closes the center, after which we play for the breakthrough. In fact, we see a very similar setup and a similar looking line in the sidelines. There, white had a pawn on f3. Now white has a bishop on e2, slightly different, but essentially the same type of an idea. Black threatens cd5, after which white will either lose a lot of time to recapture with a piece, or will be left with a pawn weakness on d5. So it's normal for white to take. Knight takes. And now we see that the bishop on e2 can also be awkward. Like sometimes black threatens knight d4, a square which is not easy to control. Maybe the most prudent way is to try to, abandon the aggressive ideas, play knight f3, just to control this square, and play a complicated middle game after queen a5. White should not play queen d6 because of knight e4. And this gives black time to go bishop e6, rook 8 d8, and then play for d5. I'm not saying black is better, but black has a nice playable position, which is all we ask for from any opening. And if white castles instead, attacking our so-called weakness, the pawn on d6, this weakness really turns into strength after d5, which is an important move to know. Now, white takes with a knight, and the e4 pawn is hanging, and it's a big pawn to lose. And if white takes ed, knight d4, suddenly it turns out that black has a huge attack. Taking twice doesn't work because of knight g4, and white actually loses some material, as you will discover if you give it some thought. And if white does not take on d4, it's not better, because black will just get a huge attack by, say, taking on d5 or playing bishop f5, rook c8. This knight is actually really strong and is a forever problem in white's position. And basically, this is not a way for white to play, so we can move back. This was the story of bishop e2. And as we saw, bishop e2 does not really give white any attacking chances despite the appearances. And this leaves us with probably the best of this sort of positional sidelines on move 4. The kingside fianchetto with g3. This g3 move was popularized by world champion Anatoly Karpov back in the 70s, 80s. There is a famous game that he won against the Dutch Grandmaster Jan Timman, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea of g3 is basically to keep it simple. White wants to go bishop g2, knight g to e2, and then castle short and keep things quiet, positional, and these pieces then protect the central pawns. This is basically the idea. And this is not threatening in a way, right? For now, so black has a lot of freedom to do stuff. So we start, of course, by developing the bishop and castling. So this is always our default. Bishop g2, castles, and okay, white can go knight f3, of course, but it's a bit strange. It's like, you could go knight f3 and then go g3, and this would decidedly look weird, yeah. And I think if you do it in this way, it also looks strange somehow. c5 is one of the possibilities. Black can do other things, but essentially after c5, castles takes, knight c6, white gets sort of one of those dragon Sicilians where white played the least threatening setup, and now has some problems with the knight on d4 because bishop e3 runs into knight g4. Yeah, this is basically the best of the dragons, and now usually the knight has to move somewhere. It either goes to b3 or to e2, and then black starts playing for b5. Yeah, so this knight leaves, and then we play for rook b8, b5, and start pushing on the queen side. Usually black gets a very comfortable position. So this is just for general info. In general, if anyone plays g3, then they should know that knight g to e2 is the way to play. And we know it by now. The knight on e2 has a drawback of being dominated by the black pawn on e5. So we play e5 here as well. And also it's good to notice that this e5 now cannot really be attacked by anything. It's just a solid central pawn. And now black has black exerts a certain amount of pressure on white center, especially on this pawn on d4 in the short term. So black's idea is, for instance, to go knight e6, force this pawn to do something. And it's very important to sort of understand the short-term strategy of this position, because it's important for white to defend the central pawn, but it's not easy to do so. So basically, the bishop on e3 is important, but white also needs to connect it to h3 so as to avoid the knight jumping to g4. And this explains certain things. Yeah? Like, for instance, why is h3 a big move in this position, for instance? Because otherwise, if you see this position for the first time, it might look strange to you that, in the midst of development, white would go h3. So white has two big moves in this position, leading to different setups. One of them is h3, one of them is castle short. So let's see what happens if white would just castle short. Black plays knight c6, essentially asking white about their intentions as to this pawn on d4, because now white cannot really go bishop e3, as this would run into knight g4 with pretty disastrous consequences because this weakening is always ugly and not great. So this is something to avoid. Now since white cannot go bishop e3, white is forced to do something in the center, right? And when being forced to do something in the center, usually the choice is, well, you can take, or you can play d5. Yeah, so we'll take a look at both these moves. So d5, knight e7 just leads to like a really bad version of the King's Indian for white. Basically, this knight has no business on e2. It's not a great knight. And this pawn really should be on c4. And next, black will just go c6. And we'll either get strong central pawns, or white will end up with a weakness on d5. But okay, without even getting too deep into this position, it's just good to know that it's just a bad version of another opening for white. In fact, a really bad one. Yeah, both this pawn on c2 is a problem, and this knight is just badly placed. So this is not a good version. And white is then essentially forced to take d takes c5, which just leads to these pretty symmetrical structures. In fact, I could make them both green. And there is no reason why white should be better at all in this position. This bishop g5 is normal and popular, sort of creating a threat of takes, and knight d5 to attack the c7 pawn. Then we have the problem here, But black has a million ways to stop this. So queen takes d1, I quite liked. For instance, after rook a d1, h6, bishop e3, b6, the fact that we can annoy him with bishop e6 is quite nice. Yeah, the rook on f1 will feel this pressure along this diagonal, and also black sometimes can jump knight b4, threaten this pawn. So essentially, black is just more harmoniously placed. And once again, the knight on e2 is not great, in these positions. Make it red. And rook fd1 is maybe more sophisticated, removing the rook from f1, where it could be potentially a problem, but basically just doesn't change very much. Here, I quite like this maneuver with knight e8, basically just playing like ultra solid chess. Black defends the weakness on c7, and gets ready to develop everything very, very positionally with f6, rook f7, bishop e6, and bishop f8. Black just has no weaknesses whatsoever, and this makes it very difficult for white to find anything like a plan. Most players would suffer here with white, because just like if you cannot attack anything, what do you possibly attack, right? So white will probably end up shuffling pieces, and we do have a proper plan. Yeah? So I think very soon over the board you will be probably better, and and basically these endings are nothing to spend too much time on. So we return to the more central way to play, which is h3. Sometimes the side pawn moves can be more central ways to play, because white is actually supporting bishop e3 to support the central pawns. Yeah, so in a way, this is a more central approach. Happens like this sometimes. We'll play knight c6. Went a bit too fast there. So knight c6, once again, pressing the pawn. And we know by now d5 is rarely a good idea. h3 there is also not really helpful. So bishop e3. That's why white played h3. So we need to stay consistent. And basically this type of position where white played g3 and defended the central pawns is an important one to understand. if you do nothing with black, as in nothing specific, nothing concrete, and slowly white, will castle, play queen d2, put the rooks into the center, and slowly black will start suffocating due to the lack of space. This happens sometimes. I do remember one game that I played. I was a kid. I think the year must have been like 89 or 90, maybe 91, but I don't think so. Anyway, one of those years, a long time ago. Yeah, and I played an experienced older player who just we were playing the G3 King's Indian, but at some point I was just I didn't have moves. My position just became so passive with black. And I noticed with some curiosity that some of these memories from the early steps in chess we remember forever. You'd think that this game should have, not had consequences of the kind as to be remembered 35 years later. But somehow I still remember this. I still recall this feeling of, oh my God, I just cannot move a single piece. Yeah. So it's not a story to say that this position is bad for black, not at all. But it is a story that indicates that in some of these positions where white has more space, that black is the one who needs to act faster because white actually profits from any delay. And that's why we sort of go for the immediate clarification, play ed, knight d4, and bishop d7. Basically, the idea is to play against this pawn. So rook e8, and then maybe takes and bishop c6, or maybe c5 and bishop c6. But essentially, this pawn is the source of our counterplay. So white naturally castles. At some point, the king has to get out. Rook e8. So this is, has always been the point, right? We are playing against this pawn. This rook is quite useful here. And in general, is excellently placed. Now white has various ways of dealing with, the threat of takes and c5, or the intention of takes and c5. Some of the moves are good, some, less so. The one natural way to play is to move the knight away, physically removing the possibility of takes and c5, right? But this runs into other problems. Black can just go b5 and threaten the e4 pawn in an unexpected manner. This exchange is a positional disaster for white because the e4 pawn is just so much more valuable than the b5 pawn in this position. And white can also not really stop this because black will just insist. And it's very difficult for white to keep the e4 pawn alive and well. And for this reason, knight d to e2 is just some sort of a mistake. This move is much better, similar to the main line with rook e1. And here also we'll just take, play c5. And white would normally play bishop e3 here. But once again, it's like super difficult to defend the e4 pawn after bishop c6. White will probably take bishop f6 here. Takes, and we need to make sure that we do not blunder the d6 pawn. Knight d5, queen d8, and basically it leads to a typical position for this line where white has this knight, which is, you could say it's well placed, although it's really not very threatening. And black, as a compensation, has a pair of bishops and a very easy plan to expand on the queen side. You could say it's about equal. You could also say black has a more pleasant position to play. Both of them are reasonably true statements, I think. So we are moving on. One more mistake white could make in this position is play f4. Sometimes this is strategically desirable for white to get the space and have two strong pawns in the center, but right now it just doesn't work because white has too many weaknesses behind the pawns, especially the hanging bishop on e3, and because of this, black simply has a winning tactical trick with knight takes e4. The lines are not too difficult. You can take a look at this position yourself. Basically, no matter what white does, black will go d5 and will win some material back with usually disastrous consequences for white. This bishop is, make it red, this bishop is hanging, the pawn on g3 will be hanging, especially if the rook will enter the third rank. It just doesn't work for white. And this leaves us with another central move, rook e1. Sort of makes sense in the future just to defend the pawn one more time. Black's reaction is still the same, takes, expand. And now we already saw what bishop takes f6 looks like, right? In the other line. The queen f6, black has the bishops with a similar type of game. But now maybe white can save the bishop, keep the bishop pair, bishop c6, and say queen d3. So basically white is also developing naturally, defending the e4 pawn, preparing rook a d1. So normally white should be doing quite well because black, you could say, has a weakness on d6 and potentially the weakness of the square on d5. But in reality, our pieces are actually really well placed to control these weaknesses, especially after the next move. Yeah, we'll play rook e6, sort of combining the defense and offense. The rook helps to defend d6, and we're also getting ready to sort of triple or double on the e file and continue to attack this pawn. So basically, white can do a lot of things. For instance, knight d5 is natural. Just play queen d7. And we are planning to go rook e8, attacking this pawn, and then we can always expand on the queen side. And I think this will lead to some interesting, strategically difficult fight. Especially, I think, strategically difficult for white because the white bishops are not really doing anything. And I have a lot of hope for this bishop on this diagonal. And even if we have to, at some point, take on d5, I think the white bishops will not be much of a threat for black, and black will still have the possibility to expand on the queen side with b5, b4, and this bishop will be strong on this diagonal. Can make it green probably better. And yeah, I think this is a very easy to play plan with knight takes d4 and c5, and I think by now enough has been said about the g3 line. So let's just go back to see how it all started. This is the move g3 in this position. Let me remove the arrows now that no longer serve any purpose. Now I think we're done with the study of this g3 line. As I said, this was a line which was popularized by Karpov back in the day, but by now I think you are as convinced as I am that black has more than enough resources to get proper counterplay in this position, and it's not even this difficult. It's not even that difficult. And yeah, I think it's time for us to move on.